Good morning and welcome back to you all to the conference. With apologies for a bit of delay, we have been waiting for Paul Tang to join. Paul, what a pleasure to have you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me? Sorry, I feel relieved that we finally be in touch because I've been here 5 minutes past 11 and somehow we couldn't get into the system.
No worry, we're always there for plan B, and I will give you the floor now because, Paul, a lot is happening in the European Parliament. There's a lot of negotiation going on.
Yeah,
We just read the news on CSDDD this
yeah,
morning, and I think you may also share something on Solvency too. So please go ahead, give us your impulse speech on what matters on sustainability. Thank
yeah.
you.
Well, I'm relieved that the connection has been established, and it's a pleasure to speak here. Um, but I won't start with the news of today. I will do that at the end of the speech. Let me go back and in fact start with the preparation of this piece. The question came to my mind: are pension funds and insurance companies the unlikely heroes that will save the world? Right? Unlikely, of course, because it's making a reference to the general public. Most of the population is financially illiterate and is blissfully ignorant of the actual work of pension funds and insurance companies and all the complexities that it involves. On average, people have the basic understanding that they may expect a pension from the retirement age onward, or they may expect financial compensation after a calamity like a fire or an accident, but that's it. People know little about ALM models, actuarial projections, statistical probabilities, and all that, so it's unlikely that they understand the financial work, let alone that they see coming that pension funds and insurance companies could turn out to be the heroes of our time. And of course, I'm not an expert myself, nor do I want to be, but I am a trained economist, having a PhD in long-run economic growth, and a practicing politician working on sustainable finance since 2018. So I dare to say I have a slightly better understanding than the average of financial markets and of pension funds and insurance companies. Yet even to me, the word unlikely applies. Up to now, I've never thought of any financial institutions of heroes. To be honest, I was only preparing this impulse speech when this thought came to my mind. And why did this question popped up? Why did this thought popped up in my mind? It could, of course, be that I saw the slow progress at COP28 and that I was in need of heroes, but it's not even that. When I'm preparing, I was realizing how important it is to have investors with a long time horizon, important for the economic systems and their impact on people and planet. And I would like to argue they make a world of difference. And to explain you that further, I don't go to today, but I take a step back to 2018. In 2018, the so-called high-level expert group on sustainable finance published a report. It set out the agenda for sustainable finance. And the starting point of that report was that huge investments are needed to transform our economies and societies to become sustainable. The estimate was that the European Union needed to invest about 700 billion euros each year more in this decade than in the previous decade to decarbonize our economies. And the upshot, of course, was that it could not be done by the public sector alone, that the private sector should also invest at an equal or more than equal footing than the public sector, invest in sustainability, of course. And I think that conclusion was the starting point of the sustainable finance agenda. It's still relevant, very relevant today. But I distinctly remember reading the report, or at least scanning the report, and realizing the daunting task ahead. I specifically remember reading, and I quote, "Sustainable finance cannot thrive if it's undermined by short-termism." And the experts in that report were not alone in that thinking. Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, was quoted, who coined the term the tragedy of the horizon. The fear was and is that while interests of the ultimate beneficiaries are best served by maximizing returns over a long, lengthy period, the time horizons for the intermediaries influencing and making the investment decisions are much more limited, focusing on quarterly reports or the end of year bonuses. And the experts put much emphasis in their recommendations about the preferences of the ultimate beneficiaries that they needed to be taken into account. But it's not just about preferences, of course. It's also the possibilities the future may hold. It has become clear that the future is not a linear extrapolation of past developments or a logical combination of mega trends. If it ever was, look out for the tipping points. A recent report from researchers of different universities warned that some Earth system tipping points are no longer high impact, low likelihood events, but they are rapidly becoming high impact, high likelihood events. They specifically point then to the Amazon dieback, the Antarctic ice sheet instability, permafrost thawing, and a classic, I would say, the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the warm water circulation in the Atlantic, the AMOC. And for each possibility, it is clear that when the tipping point is reached, it has a huge impact both on people and planet. And that includes the financial sector. And as Mark McCartney has stated, once climate change becomes the defining issue for financial stability, it may be already too late. In other words, the conclusion is clear. Our economies, our societies cannot afford short-termism from each perspective, social, financial, and ecological. And already in 2018, the problem of short-termism was on the table. And in 2023, the question arises whether that problem is still as relevant as it was then. In other words, what is the impact of the sustainable finance framework up till now? And let me try to address that quickly, because I think that's important, because it will show the way forward also. Now, the sustainable finance agenda started with measuring. Measurement is everything. And based on this idea, a system developed over the course of the 20th century for measuring and verifying and distributing financial information, implying a vast industry of accountants, controllers, and auditors. And this has allowed money to flow to economic activities that have the highest return and thus promoting economic growth. But these data are lacking for sustainability. And to make measuring sustainability possible, the EU launched the Sustainable Finance Strategy in 2018, based on two pillars: transparency requirements and sustainability standards. Well, firstly, through the SFDR, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, investment funds are obliged to publish sustainability features of their sustainable financial products from 2020 onwards. And this has created a sizable market, right? It has been estimated that the size of the sustainable funds is around 56% of the European fund market. And it has come along with pressure from the financial sector for a logical follow-up. Reporting by financial market participants also require reporting by companies that they finance. And this has led to a revision of the European reporting obligations. Now the CSRD, large companies in Europe in particular, are obliged to publish sustainability data from the beginning of next year. So that's a transparency requirement. And secondly, standards have been created through the taxonomy regulation to determine which economic activities, and therefore investment in these activities, are sustainable. And these standards go much further than climate change, but also include the preservation of biodiversity. And by having companies report how many of their activities and investments meet the standards, the taxonomy should ensure that investors can invest their money in sustainable activities in a more targeted way. And it is having impact, right? Indeed, companies in the Stocks Europe 600 index report taxonomy alignment of around 23% of capital expenditure, CapEx, and 17% for revenue. So it's fair to say that the transparency requirements and the sustainability standards introduced thus far have had impact on reporting and also on financial markets. And the impact will only grow since some of the regulations still need to kick in. But it would even be too limited to just look at the direct effect of the regulation and ignore the indirect effects. The sustainable finance strategy had an effect also through the so-called Brussels effect. For example, there are many countries outside the European Union that have introduced sustainability standards, the taxonomy, from the UK to Japan. And furthermore, European requirements for transparency have led to new requirements for sustainability reporting being worked under the umbrella of the International Foundation for Reporting Standards, the IFRS. And now, there you see there is a difference between the European approach and the global approach. The IRF is based on financial materiality, that is the financial risk around sustainability that impact the profitability of a company, whereas the European approach is based on full materiality. Not only the financial risks for the company are central, but also the impact of the company on people and planet need to be taken into account, need to be reported. Now, I'd still like to think that there are good reasons to think that full materiality will have a beneficial effect on sustainability. First, transparency on a company's sustainability impact can give stakeholders other than shareholders more power, a better say, with information on the company's sustainability impact. The environment or environmental organizations, NGOs, trade unions, journalists can hold companies to account. Secondly, not unimportant, I would say, many private and also some institutional investors expect their investments not only to have a good return, but also to do well. Research, for example, shows that 64% of the German and French investors would like to invest sustainably, even if that implies a lower return. And without full materiality, there's no good way to verify that these investor expectations are actually being met. Now, financial materiality can be a prelude to full materiality. This could partly also prevent the segmentation of the financial markets. And this is even more true, there it comes back, if there is focus on the long run and not on the short run. Then the differences between, let's say, the global or American approach and the European approach will diminish, at least to some extent. The point is, the European Union is leading in sustainable finance. It has shown the way forward for other countries, other jurisdictions, and this impact is not to be underestimated. In other words, we have been 5 years working on sustainable finance and we have achieved a lot, something I'm proud of. But the real question is it enough? And to be precise, is the impact of the sustainable finance framework up till now enough to reform financial markets and to redirect funds towards sustainable investment? And I'm afraid I have to argue, no, it's not enough. And let me explain that. The advantage of transparency that also journalists can dive into the data on sustainability, and a number of journalists show that almost 50% of all European so-called dark green financial products still invest in fossil fuels and aviations. And this seems to indicate greenwashing. The funds are presented as greener than they actually are. Indeed, European regulators, the ESAs, find in a series of reports that large part of the financial markets itself see greenwashing as a potential risk. And greenwashing is a form of deception, and that's a problem in itself. The problem is also that it implies that the capital markets are not yet functioning properly, and therefore are not yet sufficiently successful in allowing money to flow into sustainable activities. Indeed, in UNCTAD's World Investment Report of this year, it notes that despite the large growth in funds that are transparent about sustainability, the shortage of investment in sustainability is increasing, not decreasing. Second, that conclusion is already disappointing, but it's even more disappointing that funds still flow towards investment in activities that are not aligned with the Paris scenarios, that do not fit now or later in the transition towards sustainable economies. I take the example of ExxonMobil. In October, it bought Pioneer's significant oil and gas fields for almost $60 billion or euro. And the amount showed that ExxonMobil assumes that fossil fuels will remain a scarce resource for some time to come. with oil and gas prices well above the costs of extraction. Well, we know from research, for example, for the Carbon Tracker Initiative in 2017, that to keep climate changes within the 2 degrees Celsius, 80% of the fossil fuel reserves must remain unused. There should be no shortage of fuel with correspondingly high prices. Still, the market thought it was a fair price that ExxonMobil paid, and the stock price of ExxonMobil did not move. Now, take another example. In that same month, Shell. We know that fossil fuels need to be used less and less in a near and in a distant future. So if the company doesn't change, the company will generate increasingly lower sales in the future. That would be the idea. Yet the stock price of Shell almost rose to an almost record high level after the company announced on October 25 that it would lay off 50% of the employees in the sustainability division. And the truth is, of course, that the more companies and investors postpone the costly interventions, such as writing down the value of harmful activities or postponing investment in sustainable activities, the cost of making the change will only get higher. And these higher costs may in turn encourage governments to extend legal deadlines or weaken legal requirements at the last moment. And the story would then be the sector is not ready for it yet. No, of course not. It has not invested. And this creates or increases the credibility problem of future government policy. Now, it was probably at this point in my preparation I started to develop a deep affection for long-run investors and ask myself, could they be the unlikely heroes and save the world? Because the conclusion is transparency requirements and sustainability standards are important. They help to provide insight in how sustainable companies and their investors are. However, this is not enough to divert investment flows. Short-sightedness combined with doubt about future government policies stand in the way and lead to too much emphasis on the short run. In other words, nice words about sustainability and empty promises about net zero will not do. Financing the transition towards sustainability will have to be central so that risks and consequences for the long run are better identified. Moreover, the framework of sustainable finance is then not limited by focusing on transition, not limited to sustainable activities and sustainable companies, but is broadened to activities and companies that can and want to make the transition towards sustainability. It's not about being sustainable, it is about becoming sustainable. And this brings me towards today. I think what we really need to do is to require transition plans for companies and financial institutions. By dividing the long-term goals into the short-term steps, investments can no longer be postponed and costs can no longer be delayed. And the transition plans bring the future towards the present. And let me be clear, an EU-wide plan for transition is not sufficiently concrete and specific for companies and their investors. This is why the European transition plans must be linked to sectoral pathways, showing when and how much emissions reductions are needed for each sector. And these sector-specific transition plans must state both what is expected of companies and what is expected also of governments for creating the preconditions for the transition. And the company's specific transition plans can be set against these sectoral pathways to see whether a company is ahead or behind in the transition. And related to that, the review of the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which is on the table, should lead to the introduction of a new category of funds that aim to finance the transition towards sustainability. In this category, transition plans take center stage. Apart from that, the SFDR needs to be broadened. So it is not just about sustainable funds, but it's also the not sustainable funds under Article 6 that start to report on their impact on people and planet. This was the original position of the European Parliament back in 2018, 2019, but it's still relevant today. It reflects the principle of full materiality. And of course, I would like to see that long-term investors demand from investee companies to have credible and audited transition plans. And I would like to see that supervisors to put similar emphasis on the transition plans. It was encouraging to see that Frank Elderson, to see him announce that banks under the supervision of the ECB will face enforcement actions, including financial penalties, if they fail to address climate-related and environmental risks. And this is a good example of the role that supervisors can and should play. When I have worked and work on what we call in this house level 1 legislation, I'm fully aware of the limitations of legislation. A law is a dead letter unless it's brought to life by a proactive supervisor. And this is especially true for sustainable finance, which is work in progress and is therefore not finished, let alone perfect. Guidance by supervisors in any shape or form is crucial to make the work in progress really effective. First step is transition plans. Second step is to align the different legislation and make sure that they really work. Even more importantly, I think the transition should be a just transition. And I think there's consensus on that. And there's a clear need to expand the metrics for sustainability to include social considerations and government aspects. And a third step, and that brings us to today, is to ensure corporate responsibility. It may take different forms. The obligations to do due diligence, the duties for care for directors to take into account, the executives need to take into account the impact on climate change, on human rights and so on, and or the link between remuneration and sustainability goals under the principle, like I said, I'm an economist, put your money where your mouth is. And this will all contribute that corporates and executives can no longer simply ignore the damage of activities and investments therein on people and planet. Now, this morning, early this morning, after a long night, the negotiations on the CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, sorry for this long term, has been concluded. It was not the success we entirely wanted. The financial sector doesn't have this due diligence requirement after fierce pushback, most notably from France, but also from other countries. So that's not taking. But the good thing is to see that the climate plans are still very much enshrined in this new regulation. And it's also good to see that the remuneration is very much linked to this climate plans. So it's a step. But I think in the end, we need to have the long run taken into account by financial markets. We need to have long run investors. And this is why I so much emphasize the transition plans. It brings the future to the present, because if we don't, we may end up hurting people and planet a great deal. I think the negotiation this morning is another step in that direction, but we need proactive supervisors and long-run investors also to step up to the plate to make sure that the agenda for the sustainable finance agenda will really work. We're near the tipping point. We're nearly there, but we need to make it work to make sure that the financial markets are indeed taking the long run into account. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul, and so happy again that you made it. Paul, indeed, we have a few questions from the audience, but we have maybe a bit of limited time.
Sure.
But of course, we'll manage, because it's great to have you on. And maybe let's start with, I mean, you mentioned at the beginning, maybe the insurance sector or the pension sector will be the unlikely heroes of this debate. Now, what I start sensing, and maybe I'm a little bit blunt, but I start sensing that people want the supervisors to become the heroes of the world, especially now that we have seen that the financial sector is out of the CSDDD. And I'm just a bit, I'm not critical, I'm just a bit tempting the devil with the questions that we received. How can supervisors actually, in a prudential context, indeed, request actually transition efforts from the insurance industry. And that is one of the questions with the failure, let's say, of the CSDDD. That is one of the hot topics we received. Thank you.
Sure, no, I fully understand that question. For me, it's an interplay, right? When I think about what is a fair game, you need good rules, you need a good referee, and you need players that wanting to play fair. So it's the legislator, it's the supervisor, and the financial market participants that need to interact. Now, like I said, the legislation will not be perfect. It's work in progress. And it will probably never be. So that requires also proactive supervisors, but it will also require financial market participants that are willing to play fair, and especially that want to take the long run into account. So I would like to think that that, for example, the financial market participants, the insurance and the pension funds, really must put emphasis on transition plans, not just for the corporates they invest in, but also for the financial institutions they invest in. And the same is true for the supervisor. I gave the example of Frank Elderson from the ECB, because he made the banks under supervision aware that there are costs on their balance sheets in the long run that they need to take into account. And if they don't take action, he will enforce action. So here you see it's an interplay between the three. I know it's not perfect. I know it's work in progress, but I think that proactive supervisors and long-run investors can really make a difference already on basis of the current legislation. Coming back, I do agree that in the end of the day, we need to have corporate responsibility enshrined, not just for the corporates, but also for the financial institutions. There's a first step by linking the climate plans to the remuneration. I think we need to step further, but maybe that's more the conclusion of the sustainable finance framework than it is the start.
Thank you, Paul. And indeed, what we also see from the chat is indeed that supervisors do have a risk-based mandate. And indeed, if risks appear from the outside world on their balance sheet, there's maybe also an incentive to mitigate these risks just for that main reason. There is another question from the audience, if I understood it correctly. Indeed, you mentioned the Brussels effect, and indeed one would have expected maybe the COP28 effect to take over, and that we all speak of the COP28 effect, but there are some global differences, as we've seen on how to phase out the fossil fuels or what it actually means. So how do you see this progressing forward? So what is your main takeaway then from COP for the European financial regulations? So apart from maybe indeed what we see is focusing on transition finance, right? How is this then going to be implemented? We have the taxonomy, we have the definitions. So what kind of other measures do you think are key to make progress on this global alignment also to transition finance?
Well, what I try to argue is that Europe shows the way forward, and in this sense is leading. We are the continent where sustainable finance has taken a foothold. But the good thing to see is that it also changes the legislation and the practices outside the European Union, and it puts pressure also on the international reporting standards. In that sense, I'm not pessimistic, because I have seen this effect and this will continue. So Europe needs to show the way by making the transition plans important, to show the connection between the short run, the present, and the future. And if we can make this work, it will also have impact on the rest of the world. And we're not isolated in that sense. And I expect also, and it certainly holds for the less developing countries, that they expect us to lead the way, right? So I think the COP28 has been helpful, but we must accept that Europe is expected and needs to lead the way. That's how I see it.
Yeah. Paul, one final question, and then we will sum up and go to the panel, because I think there's a lot of food for thought. So, one participant asks, is there any plan to work further on social aspects of the ESG, of the sustainability. So what is the drive there, or the political appetite?
Yeah, I think there is a rather broad consensus that if you want to make the transition, it needs to be a just transition. I think this is accepted across the political spectrum. So I expect that the legislation will move in that direction. For the SFDR, I know there's what we call RTS underway, which which stipulates what should be taken into account when it comes to social and governance.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the first step. Discussion on taxonomy have been difficult, but also because it's very much focused on being sustainable and not on becoming sustainable. I very much hope that we can unblock the discussion on the taxonomy by broadening it to include not just the companies that are sustainable, but all the companies that will become sustainable. I think we'll have a broader base, and that will also help to introduce the broader consideration. We're fully aware, and like I said, I'd like to think that this is consensus. We cannot just have the E, we need to also discuss the S and the G.
Thank you, Paul. And with this, I think you've mentioned the SFDR. You've mentioned from the start, transparency and sustainability standards do have an impact already directly, not enough yet. And I think with this, we can also hand over to the panel, because I think they will be discussing the pitfalls and the power of transparency. And I think what we would like to hear from them and then also from the audience is, how can we actually go further and improve? Because there has been a lot of sustainability reporting and a lot of transparency requirements, but do they actually make the cut? Do they actually do what do they help? That's basically it. Paul, I thank you very much, and good luck further in Strasbourg, and talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. With this, I would like to hand over to Valérie Marriott-Wood, the head of department of the Consumer Protection Department at EIOPA. And Valérie will introduce the panel. And in the meanwhile, we would like to give the audience the opportunity to engage with a short slide.
Yes, if you could sort of unhook me, that would be great.
And I think Paul is still trying to leave. Difficult to get in, difficult to leave, EIOPA. So, dear audience, go ahead with the Slido. And Valérie, the floor is yours to start your introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela, and good afternoon to you all. Before we dive into our panel, a few words, if I may, just to set the background. The European Union initiated the Green Deal, aiming to promote sustainable investments in areas like renewable energy, biodiversity, and the circular economy to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. The EU committed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030 compared to the 1990s levels. To achieve these climate goals, and in addition to public investment plans, the EU relies as well on private sector support. This is why an important element is sustainable finance, which involves incorporating environmental, social, and governance criteria into investments and financing decisions. In order to incentivize the demand for sustainable investments, it is crucial to prevent greenwashing by improving the trust of consumers in products that claim to have sustainability features. And as Paul said earlier in his impulse speech, measuring is everything. Now, a key component of this approach is the newly created policy framework to bring transparency and measure the sustainability performance of the economy and the financial sector. The EU taxonomy, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD, and of course, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, or SFDR. Now that the Commission is assessing SFDR, the European Sustainability Reporting Standards are entering into force, and the taxonomy alignment reporting will start soon. It is important to discuss whether the policy framework ensures meaningful and consumer-friendly sustainability disclosures, and whether it is fit for the purpose of supporting the transition to a carbon-neutral economy, or, on the contrary, is creating a burden for companies that is not positively impacting the environment and people. I would now like to welcome you to this panel on the power and pitfalls of sustainability transparency. We have invited 4 distinguished panelists with different but complementary backgrounds and expertise. So on this panel, we have today Christine May of the Asset Management Unit of DG FISMA of the European Commission, Clémence Humeau, Head of Sustainability Coordination and Governance from insurance company AXA, Johannes Heers, Head of the Strategy, Policy and International Affairs Department of the AFM, the Dutch Financial Markets Authority, and Toren Reinhammer, Associate Director, Capital Markets of CPD Europe, a non-profit organization working on global disclosure systems. And we will be focusing on 3 discussion topics for this panel. First, we will discuss whether the policy reporting and disclosure framework is instrumental to financing the transition, or whether more drastic measures are needed. Then, the panel will exchange views on whether changes are necessary to financial product disclosures to make them usable and more understandable for consumers, and whether labels might be the solution. And finally, we will close the panel on discussing what is still missing to make sure the framework is suitable for the insurance and pension sector. For example, whether there is a need to regulate the use of sustainability terms in names. So let's get cracking. Let's dive straight in our first topic, which is whether the sustainable reporting landscape really has an impact on the transition. And to make sure everybody has time to respond, I will be grateful for your responses to be concise. And if I may, I will turn to Clémence for the first question. So Clémence, given the increased sustainability disclosure frameworks such as SFDR, the taxonomy regulation, and CSRD, how do you perceive the value that these requirements bring to your business? Can you elaborate on whether these efforts have influenced the way AXA selects investee companies? And if yes, have the resulting changes to investments made AXA more appealing for consumers? So over to you, Clémence.
Good morning and thank you, Valérie. So I'll focus more on the benefits and some of the drawback of SFDR in the taxonomy, given that the CSRD is not yet enforced. The one observation perhaps I would make on CSRD is that from the perspective of the investor, we very much look forward to seeing the first reporting from corporates. And I would say ideally we would have liked the regulation to have been the first one to enter into force, but that's coming, so that's definitely positive. In terms of how the new disclosure requirements, so SFDR and taxonomy, applicable to financial market participants have broad benefits, I would say the first one is definitely that ESG is now part of the discussions for all products. And that's even the case for Article 6, as we need to assess the potential impact of sustainability risks on financial performance or financial returns. So definitely, it means that discussions around ESG has increased a lot internally and with clients. When looking at SFDR, perhaps more specifically, so we are a French-based financial market participants, and we already had a number of reporting requirements on ESG policies and ESG performance at fund entity level. So I think we were in a context which was slightly different, perhaps from other geographies, and that was related to the French Article 173 of the Energy Transition Law and a local label regime. However, even if we already had some approaches in place to help mitigate some principal adverse impact with regards to climate, for instance, on coal and conventional oil and gas to some extent, around exclusion and engagement. This has, I would say, SFDR has helped us to make integration at product level even more clear, even more robust, thanks to the requirement in terms of disclosure and the various questions around the binding elements and the sustainability indicators followed by the portfolio managers. Here, I would say we have also been facing challenges in terms of the categorization and the definition of sustainable investments. So we have seen those challenges somewhat addressed by the industry with more and more discussion, and we are very happy to see RTS potentially being implemented and the SFDR level 1 review as well. In terms of disclosure, and if I compare with what we had already in the past in place, we have seen a better homogenization in the disclosure from one financial market participant to another. However, noting that in some cases, the approaches from FMPs, but also from supervisors, led to differences in terms of the level of detail, in terms of the proportionality of what is in the pre-contractual disclosure for, let's say, an Article 8 product that differs a lot from one FMP to another. So definitely areas on which we hope to see improvements and more comparability in the future. And a key challenge has been around, of course, I think we'll discuss later, but around data challenges on PIEs. Here we struggle in some cases to have robust data and on taxonomy as well. So I would say the discussion with clients and the discussions internally have still been focused quite a lot on how we can gather proper data, how we can make sense of the data. And that's definitely essential to then change behavior and make sure we can integrate this even more in the investment process. On taxonomy, and if I compare with PIEs, it's more nascent, given that corporates have reported alignment for the first time this year, so covering 2022. It's, however, already useful, I would say, to support the analysis of corporate sustainability strategies and to support shareholder engagement and discussion with the companies. In particular, we find taxonomy to be very useful to go into the detail of transition plans. So understanding how a corporate is defining their transition strategies and how that translates at economic activity level, with the CapEx data being especially useful. So overall, I would say very positive to see the level of transparency. We have tried to be very proactive and to support our clients in understanding the regulation. I think that has been appreciated on the where AXA has, I would say, benefited from the regulation, and on how we will change behavior and support the financing of the transition. I think that's to be further reinforced more and more with improvement to the regulation. But I'm confident, taxonomy reporting is improving, CSRD is coming, so I'm confident that we'll be even. We will support even more the financing of the transition in coming years.
Thank you, Clémence. I must now hand over to Christine for the Commission. So, Christine, the Commission has recently announced a target of reducing burdens associated with reporting requirements by 25%, and postponed the deadline for adoption of sector-specific European sustainability reporting standards. So, what is the feedback you're gathering on the usefulness of taxonomy reporting for business and investors? What are the key issues that need to be addressed to ensure comparability of third country company data, which is needed to disclose on international investments to comply with EU sustainability reporting framework?
And good afternoon, everybody. Well, as Clémence has already indicated, I think there's been a lot of positive feedback that we're getting. We've also seen the first indications as to the uptake of taxonomy reporting, for instance, which are quite encouraging. Of course, the framework was built over quite a short period of time, so we moved quite quickly because there is obviously an urgency here. But it also means that we're now sort of looking at how the framework is actually working in practice, because, as you rightly said, it's not just a compliance exercise. We actually want to achieve an impact here, and we want to ensure that private capital flows into the transition. And that, of course, means transparency for investors to make informed choices. But it also means, of course, that those that produce the disclosures and the reporting need support and need guidance. And the Commission has been working very energetically to provide that. We've issued a number of FAQs, for instance, related to the taxonomy, to give guidance on the interpretation of criteria or interpretations of criteria that are laid down in the taxonomy. We have another FAQ on the way that's set to be adopted still this year when it comes to the taxonomy alignment reporting for financial market participants. Obviously, we have online tools like the Taxonomy Compass. We've been working with the platform on sustainable finance. As Clémence here on the panel, that's a really important point for us. But of course, there is more to do, and I think we will continue with this exercise. You've mentioned the availability of data. That's clearly a very crucial point. We think that indeed the introduction of the ESRS will bring a big improvement. I would also like to mention the European single access point, which we think has an important role to play. But of course, as you rightly asked about, a lot of the investee companies in particular, or economic activities that we're concerned with, don't take place in the EU. And there, of course, the question is how can we ensure that we close or help to close data gaps? That's indeed an issue we're looking at in the context of the assessment of the SFDR that we're currently carrying out, for instance, and that we will be talking about a bit later. So
thank you, Christine. We need to move on because we have a lot to cover, and you know, obviously this is a very important topic. So I would like to turn to Torun now, and I would ask you, how important are carbon and climate impact disclosures to enable Europe to move to a low carbon economy? And is finance the right lever to lead on climate transition? So what is missing to incentivize the transition? Do we need more drastic measures? For example, what are the pros and cons of a brown taxonomy, if we want to be a little controversial?
Oh, thank you. So first of all, for those of you who don't know CDP, I want to mention that it's a not-for-profit organization that since more than 20 years run the global disclosure system for companies and subnational governments to manage their environmental impacts and dependencies. And this year, 23,000 companies disclosed to CDP, data that we then provide to the market. So the theory of change that lies behind transparency is instrumental for the transition, as stakeholders need to measure and publicly disclose certain information. They actually realize how big their impact and dependencies are, and that is the trigger for change. Finance is for sure an important factor, but companies have many more reasons to change, like climate and nature-related risks are real for their businesses. And they will realize this when they start to report on it if they haven't done it before. We also have a lot of companies that show a true desire to change also for other reasons, like to be able to attract talent, etc. Another way that disclosure impacts companies fundamentally that we maybe talk less about is how much it actually changes the ways of working inside entire organizations, where different departments have to work together in ways they didn't do before. For instance, sustainability and finance are not anymore two isolated topics, but they have to work together. And transition plans, of course, come in here also as a very important tool to get the understanding from the whole organization that it needs to change. But the greatest challenge is related, of course, to the pace of change. Is it fast enough to prevent irreversible damages and climate-related catastrophes that are foreseen by science? No, it's not. And disclosure alone will for sure not do the job. So here, regulations that are more prescriptive play also a large role, like, for instance, the deforestation regulation in the EU. But turning to finance, unfortunately, in terms of pricing the risks and costs of climate change and nature loss, this is still not well integrated into decision making because, as Paul Tang also pointed out, most our economic and financial models are not well suited to the longer horizon and uncertainty related to such impacts. Interventions to correct this market failure and to put the price on carbon and on resource depletion, for instance, are necessary to go faster. Also, talking about a just transition, the redistributive aspect of the transition needs to come from fiscal policy innovations that are yet to be seen. Another aspect where regulation currently prevents necessary shift to capital is how pensions capital can be invested. Pension funds are well placed to make long-term investments, but in many cases they are unable to invest, for instance, in regions and projects where the money would actually have the most positive impact on climate and nature. the rules to protect savings have been put in place for a good reason. And a more flexible approach to this has to be done with guardrails, of course, but also keeping in mind that not mitigating climate change and natural resource depletion and not invest in climate adaptation will carry very high risks that are currently not accounted for.
Thank you, Torun. I would now like to turn to Johannes, and my question to you would be, as a supervisor, how can you hold institutional investors accountable for the disclosures of their sustainability commitments on the impact of their investments or on decarbonisation targets? Expectations are rising for supervisors to also hold financial market participants accountable for reaching targets, i.e. to implement the transition. So do supervisors have the right tools, data and resources for this?
Thank you, Valerie, and good afternoon to you all. Maybe in response to your question, I would like to raise 2 points. So in general accountability, we think it can be enhanced by requiring financial market participants to clearly communicate about their sustainable commitments and ask for indicators that are used to measure these commitments. Only then we can use the SFDR disclosures to hold financial markets participants accountable for their performance on sustainability aspects. And especially the obligation to periodically report will help to hold financial market participants accountable. And in order for this to work, we must take a critical view at the way in which these objectives, sustainability objectives and indicators are formulated. If they are too vague or indicators are missing or not relevant, this must be addressed and improved. So examples for this is decarbonization targets, a net zero target with a very long-term horizon, but without any intermediate targets. And supervisors can, through their supervision of the SFDR information, play a role in this process. So the second point is I think on transition targets, and Paul and Clemens also talked about this. I think first of all, financial market participants should be aware of the scrutiny of investors, of auditors, of third parties like NGOs and journalists. So there's a broad spectrum of people who scrutinize activities of financial market participants when it comes to meeting the sustainability objectives, like transition goals. Not practicing what you preach can lead to serious reputational issues. And where financial markets participants claim that they invest in companies or projects that are in transition, they should also make sure that they monitor transition plans of the investees. Financial market participants can play an important role by using their influence to stimulate investee companies in making this transition through voting and engagement practice. If transition sub-targets of these investee companies are not met, then financial market participants should take appropriate action and inform their investors about this. So the AFM is in favor of setting up specific quality and disclosure requirements for financial products that claim to focus on transition investments. These requirements should help to hold financial market participants accountable on the progress that is made in the transition, and also help investors and their advisors to guide participants towards such products. Investing in the transition is crucial to achieve the goal of transitioning into a sustainable economy. Thank you.
Many thanks, Johannes. I would like now to turn to the second topic for our panel, which is the discussion around the actual disclosures and whether these can be improved to make them more consumer friendly, and whether labels are the solution. And to start with, I would put a question to Christine for the Commission. So Christine, in the retail investment strategy, the Commission has proposed that all insurance-based investment products disclose on taxonomy alignment and greenhouse gas emissions intensity. Is this the future direction for changes in the review of the SFDR on which you're currently consulting? Can you tell us a little more as to what you're consulting on?
Yes, of course. We've actually just extended the deadline of the ongoing consultations, so stakeholders will have an extra week to respond. They will be open until the 22nd of December. So what we are currently doing is we are assessing the SFDR and how it works in practice, because a lot has changed since the proposal was made in 2018 and since it was adopted. And we just want to be clear about the impact it's having, whether it's achieving its objectives, and whether the rules are still fit for purpose. And the consultations are an important part of this exercise. We are looking at the SFDR as it works today, how it interacts with the other parts of the sustainable finance framework, such as the taxonomy, PRIPS, you've just mentioned it, sustainability preferences in MiFID. So there is a lot of interaction, and we would like to be sure that everything works together as smoothly as it should. And we're also looking ahead at potential changes that could be made in the future. Disclosures are obviously at the heart of the SFDR, and we are looking at possible ways of making them more effective for different types of investors, retail investors obviously being a very important group here. We're also looking at the potential introduction of product categories in this context, which we think is an interesting idea, worth looking into. And we will, when the consultations are closed, take stock and see where we go from there. Obviously, any political decisions will need to be taken in the coming mandate. Yes, so stay tuned.
Thank you, Christine. Johannes, based on your experience with the SFDR consumer testing, would you be supportive of labels by insurance-based investment products, or IBITs, and pension scheme categories? And what should these categories reflect? What criteria could such labels have so that they can be used in practice by the insurance and pension products? What can we learn from the Commission proposal for PRIPS?
Yes, thank you. Maybe we published a position paper for the SFDR review recently. I'll shortly outline what's the main points in there. We think that current sustainability disclosures under the SFDR are not sufficiently focused on the needs and understanding of especially retail investors. We have performed consumer testing, as you said, on their understanding of SFDR information, which shows that consumers are struggling to understand the information which is provided. And we also performed consumer research into the objective of retail consumers when investing in sustainable products. And we found that most retail investors want to make impact, and that based on the information currently provided, it is hard for them to assess if a financial product is meeting those objectives. So in light of the announced SFDR review, we published this position paper, and we propose to make the framework more consumer-oriented and introduce product labels that help investors select appropriate products. And specifically, we propose to introduce sustainable product labels that investors can understand, such as a transition category, a sustainable investment category, and sustainable impact category, to ensure alignment with investor expectations and objectives, as well as the actual sustainability profiles of these investment products. So to these labels, we would like to attach specific minimum quality and disclosure requirements tailored to each of these labels to address greenwashing risk and make classifications of these labels more meaningful in the practice. In general, we acknowledge that pension and insurance products may find it difficult to meet these criteria to fit under one of the labels. That's why in our proposal, products that have a more widespread portfolio can still voluntarily choose to report on the percentages of the total portfolio of investments that do fall within the requirements of one of these categories, which I mentioned, so transition, sustainable, or sustainable impact. And by doing so, they can provide investors with insight into the percentage of total investments that fall within one of these sustainability categories. The AFM is in favor of a disclosure regime that supports a level playing field for all financial products with or without sustainable features. So this would mean that all investment products, I think Paul Tang also mentioned this earlier, that all investment products, including pensions and insurance products, should make disclosures on a limited number of sustainability indicators in order for investors to assess the most important impact. Only for products that would carry one of these proposed sustainability labels, we would expect as additional disclosures tailored to this specific label. And this system would help investors to select sustainable products, but it also would make more quick access to products that do not incorporate sustainability, and to compare the negative impact of different financial products. Thank you.
Thank you, Johannes. Torun, what are your views on this? Are you supportive of requiring sustainability disclosure for all products or only those that promote sustainability? What is your assessment of the SFDR? Are these sustainability disclosures meaningful for users? And if not, how do we guarantee that sustainability disclosures actually provide real values to consumers?
Yes, we, as many others, we see, of course, issues with the regulation, but it's a fairly new regulation and the market needs more time to integrate and harmonize the interpretation of the new concepts of PAIs and the do no significant harm of taxonomy, etc. At the same time, SFDR has created a lot of movement in the financial sector and brought a lot of value in terms of transparency. Referring to my point on disclosure before, some investors for the first time had to think about their impact on biodiversity, water, pollution, etc. At CDP, we have experienced an explosion of interest from investors for nature-related data, thanks to the SFDR, which is, of course, very positive as a first step. And yes, absolutely, about the sustainability disclosure for all financial products. Yes, of course, we are very positive if this should be, as for companies, transparency should not be conditional to whether it does sustainable investment or not. We are strongly in favor of basic sustainability disclosure requirements for all products. The disclosures will be more meaningful to users when we improve their comparability, and also when the other side of the story will be included as part of transparency requirements. In other words, having clear statements that certain products can invest in certain types of activities that are deemed harmful, such as coal, for example, or that a product does not consider deforestation in their investment decision. Currently, this is lacking, and such investments can easily be overseen by retail investors. Before going into labels, though, we should focus on improvement of the disclosures related to SFDR. There is no point in labeling products if we can't verify their claims, because the transparency isn't there, or the indicators disclosed are misunderstood or vague or hard to compare. So go for good disclosure first. Thank you.
That's a very fair point. There's no point in labeling if there is no way that you can actually substantiate the claims. And actually, this is very topical, because turning to you, Clémence, I was going to ask you from the industry perspective, what are the major challenges of the framework to comply with these financial product disclosure rules?
Yes, thank you. So indeed, many points have been covered. I think there are three key challenges from the perspective of the industry with regards to the usability of the framework. The first one was mentioned. It's around, in some cases, the clarity of the regulatory guidance. When it comes to SFDR, we have seen a number of changes through level 2 and level 3 guidance over the past couple of years, which left some room for interpretation up to the market. So sustainable investment was mentioned. PAIs calculation were also an issue in some cases. So that has led to workload and to costs, and to, again, a lack of comparability in some cases. Again, I think we are at an important point in time with the various consultations. So now, I think what's critical for the industry is to make sure we effectively can progress and address those challenges in an efficient way. The second key challenge also was mentioned, so it's data. And so here it's data which is, of course, reported by companies. So again, we know it's improving. We know taxonomy reporting is improving, and we hope to see even more improvement in the future as the platform helps to perhaps to clarify some criteria or some, I would say, small parts which can be challenging, for instance, around DNSH. And we know CSRD is coming again, but this has created issues in terms of preparation of periodic reporting, in terms of preparation of PI statement at entity level as well. And I'll repeat what I said earlier. In a number of cases, it's also a barrier to actually confidently commit to ESG approaches in pre-contractual disclosure. So we see a number of commitments, but to go even beyond, I think we definitely need this data to be even more robust, so that we can deliver, appropriately to our end investor. So definitely quality at all steps of the value chain. So from the corporates, to some extent from the SMEs, auditors, investor, banks, and so on. That's definitely a key focus. And the last point, which was mentioned as well, is around probably the length of the templates. We talked about the reporting burden. So in some cases, the pre-contractual disclosure are quite long, with lots of detail, and in some cases, the feedback from clients is that it can be difficult to understand and to see how it interacts. Christine talked about the point around understanding how SFDR is interacting with MiFID, with IDD, and so on. I think it's definitely a very important part of the framework and greatly addressed, I would say, in the consultation. So if we have very long templates but not properly articulated with the questions in MiFID and IDD ESG preference, well, that creates, I would say, perhaps issues in the way end investor understand the questions which are asked to them as part of the sustainability preference implementation. So here, focus and proportionality of the disclosure is definitely important. And perhaps one very last word. So on the platform, the platform on sustainable finance has been working on a sort of stock take of how the sustainable finance framework is used by the different actors within the value chain. So we see definitely some very positive momentum, but also a number of priorities to help continue to improve the usability. And here, so that's to come and will be published at the beginning of next year. And I think from the perspective of probably the platform and a user as AXA, we definitely hope to see a maintained momentum to make sure that the regulation can deliver more effectively and more coherently.
Thank you, Clémence. And I think it's a fair cup to talk about the volume, the length of these disclosures in an industry where there's already a fair amount of information that must be disclosed to consumers ex ante. So, of course, that can also be, that and complexity can be a barrier to the understanding of retail consumers. Now, before we move on to the third and final topic for this panel, Pamela, did you want to show us the results of the Slido?
Yes, they might be quite informative. The Slido results are coming up. So what do we see? Can you all see it? Valérie, go ahead. How do you interpret this with the panel?
Oh, interesting. This is interesting because what it says to me is that simplicity works best. And indeed, a sliding scale, whether that's a traffic light system, whether we use letters or colors, that's just a system that is very intuitive. That is a system that is used in many industry. You can think about the agriculture industry, you know, the Nutri score on food stuff. that we are now quite used to in Europe, and it's used in other territories as well. So I really hear a call here for simplicity and something very intuitive, very at a glance information, with presumably the possibility then to dig into and access more information. So I hear simplicity, but I also hear possibly layering, you know, in the same way that you would see this Nutri-Score on a, I don't know, packet of breakfast cereals, and that gives you a first piece of information, but then you need to find out more. You need to find out, you know, the actual nutritional value. You need to find out about allergens or whatnot, you know, is it refined cereals, etc. So it really giving the consumer the key elements first, the must-know elements first in a way that is very intuitive, and also allowing for digging more into the technical information if so desired. So this is very interesting. Any reaction from our panelists before we move on to the final topic? No? Shall we move on to the final question? Excellent. So let's do this. And the third topic is really, well, what's missing? What's missing to make sure that the framework is suitable for consumers in the insurance and pension sector? Is there a need to regulate product names to address greenwashing? And for this question, I will start with Christine from the Commission. Thank you. Over to you, Christine.
Well, names are obviously hugely important, because we know that when consumers make decisions on which products to choose, the name plays such an important role. So for us, it's very clear that all financial products should have names that are clear, fair, and not misleading. I think especially when we consider what Johannes has mentioned, that consumer testing actually shows that the disclosures that are available on top of the name of the product are often not understood because they're too complex, or they refer to key concepts that are not entirely clear to people. So there's a real potential for greenwashing and mis-selling involved here when we talk about names. And that's why we feel the issue would best be addressed as part of a potential review of the SFDR, because that would allow us to really address this issue in a comprehensive manner. We would catch all the products that are part of the scope, which I think is preferable to more piecemeal approaches in, you know, the fund sector or other parts of the product universe. So we really feel that's something that we're also consulting on currently, and we're particularly interested in how potential rules on names could work once you establish, if we were to go down that route, product categories, because I think there are important interactions between those categories if they were to exist, and how you can actually name or establish naming conventions and rules. And maybe one point on the slide, sorry, I'm a bit slow, but the sliding scale or Nutri-Score, I think it's a very interesting that a lot of people sort of instantly kind of think it's an intuitive way of visualizing things. But my concern, I think, or a question maybe rather would be, how do we ensure that we don't create a kind of a hierarchy? Because, for example, when you have a traffic light, you know, green signals something is very good and red is maybe it's terrible, but where do, for example, transition assets fit into that system? You know, because that's where we want to channel funding so that, you know, companies can become greener. But if we end up with a kind of a presentation that somehow suggests that these assets should not be invested in, then I think that we might end up with a problem.
That's a very good point. When you simplify to the extreme to get to this traffic light system, there's quite a lot that can be lost in translation, and we know that the sustainable sector, the taxonomy, there's a lot of complexity, there's a lot of nuance, so it's a very difficult trade-off. Now, if I can turn to you, Torun, do you think that consumers really distinguish in terms of sustainable, ESG in the names of insurance and pension schemes? And if not, should the rules for names treat such terms similarly? Corinne, you're still on mute, I think.
Sorry about that. Well, you can just ask around among family and friends, right? And you find that most people have no clue what ESG means and have very vague ideas of what sustainable implies in this context. Not a lot of people are able to distinguish those terms, maybe not even experts. If you take the example of the EU taxonomy for sustainable economic activities, it includes gas and nuclear as transitional activity. And yeah, it's debatable if this is sustainable though. And yeah, so we are also a bit cautious about the names. What matters is the quality of the disclosures that accompany products rather than their names. It's the disclosure behind that can make it clear to consumers what they actually invest in and what they don't invest in. So also very cautious to simplify this in terms of a hierarchy, because there are also different approaches, as was mentioned, in investments, and it's not necessarily so that one investment approach, sustainable investment approach, is better than another, so to say. So it may also be misleading to put this as a hierarchy or a green light or whatever. So yeah, another point I think is worth highlighting in this context is that when it comes to people's savings, the risk management is of course a key. And in the end, many DC and DB pension schemes will be heavily invested into government bonds and other assets perceived as safe. But how sustainable is a government bond? This is still not really clear. This is a large part of savings, right? There are no methods currently, at least not widely adopted, to measure the sustainability of a government bond or for a general purpose government bond. For instance, how do you define the emissions that are attached to it? We don't see a lot of debate of investing in bonds from fossil fuel producing countries and regions. Quite the opposite, actually. It's a sensitive topic, and entire countries are not easily excluded from investment portfolios. Similarly, for personal pension products and insurance products, people put their savings in there. And perhaps we need to do much more about the fair representation of climate risk and potential losses due to it. Today, we are not there in terms of pricing of the impact of climate change and nature loss on pension assets that have much longer investment horizon than other types of products. And we need to get better pricing those long-term risks associated to climate. So finally, another remark on the secondary market, ETF type investments, for instance. In general, it is questionable how much impact they can have on the real economy. So by definition, they should probably not be able to have impact as a name, impact term in their names.
Thank you, Doran. And indeed, government bonds are quite a thorny issue in this debate, you know, for a lack of a way of measuring quite simply. So indeed. Moving to Clémence now. In France, most life insurance is sold via products which offer many options, these famous multi-option products or MOPs. So is there a need to amend the SFDR to ensure clear disclosures for investment options offered by such products that are not covered yet by the SFDR, such as structured products or company shares or indeed internal insurance funds?
Thank you. So actually, there were some very interesting developments with that regard in the RTS, which have been recently published. I would say that yes, in principle, we consider transparency to be useful. and we support, as such, more standardization in the disclosure requirement for all the underlying options, such as you mentioned, structured products or company shares. And we feel it would be appreciated by the end client because they would have a better understanding of the sustainability profile. However, if we come back to the usability challenges, we foresee many actually, and even I would say, having had a first look at the proposal made in the RTS, we think there are a number of questions which need to be tackled. So, for instance, the criteria, so on which basis would a company equity share, for instance, be classified Article 8 or Article 9? Who would be responsible for that categorization in terms of the feasibility, from a practical perspective? So, to which document would we need to attach the annex, for instance? And lastly, even if we have more standardization between the different investment option disclosure, in our view, we will still have a number of challenges in terms of the aggregation of information at the level of the multi-option product, as underlying data may still be quite heterogeneous. So, for instance, there was a point mentioned earlier on decarbonization targets with different time horizon. So here we know it's definitely a challenge in the way it's applied by the different financial market participants. So I would say I'm cautiously positive on this. What we will continue to do is to look carefully at the proposal in the RTS and discuss definitely with peers and probably as well with supervisors to understand how to implement those disclosures in a way which is useful and can be understood by the clients.
Thank you, Clémence. And finally, Johannes, your point of view as a supervisor, what tools and powers would be needed in order to adequately supervise these disclosures?
Thank you. Maybe allow me 2 remarks on the slider idea, because Christine also responded. Because I think the idea of one continuous scale is maybe a bit of a simplification of what is going on. Because I think, which is also something which we try to explain in the position paper, you have 2 dimensions maybe. So you have one dimension which is sort of value alignment and the sustainability, let's say, percentage of the investments. And on the other hand, you have the dimension of impact, which Storen also nicely put down just now. So if you're sort of reducing the discussion to one scale, it might be a simplification of what you try to demonstrate, and also the idea of a continual scale maybe suggests more precision than we can make. So it suggests a sort of a very precise instrument, which might be sort of more ambitious than we can be realized. So those were 2 things about the slider, which and then in response to your question, I think the main challenge is when it comes to sustainability disclosures with regard to the pension products and non-life. For all financial products with a more diversified portfolio, but also non-life insurance, it's challenging. So I also mentioned this in the previous question, to provide information on sustainability characteristics that is both clear and concise, but also sufficiently granular. So Clémence also highlighted the data issues. Apart from investment insurance products, we can also have sustainability objectives that are, for instance, focused on behavior of clients. So there's a very significant difference, of course, between those 2 strategies. We think that consumers will not always understand this distinction, and it's therefore very important that it's made very clear to them. information on product needs to be fair, clear, and non-misleading, and this also applies to the sustainability information, both SFDR as marketing or website information. So there's always this requirement to be clear and fair about what sustainability means. The AFM has recently published guidelines on sustainability claims, in which we outline what market participants should pay attention to when making claims. So that's maybe useful. So that's my response. Thank you.
Many thanks, Johannes. In the interest of time, I'd like to move to questions. So we have a few questions that have been submitted by our participants. And I would like to address the first one, and perhaps for you, Clémence. And the question is, clarity on targets is one thing, but how can insurers or pension providers really hold their investee companies accountable for missing the targets?
Thank you. So I think here engagement and voting, which were mentioned earlier, are quite important. And we know that SRD2 is potentially going to be reviewed in the future. So that could further clarify requirements, and I would say the oversight framework on those activities of engagement and voting. I think we have definitely seen an improvement in the way financial market participants and investors explain their criteria, explain when actually engaging with the companies, what are their expectations, what is in a way the time frame they are giving to the company to change, and what could be, if there is no sufficient change, what could be the escalation mechanism used. So for instance, through voting at AGMs, or in some cases, actually potentially divesting if there is not enough change. So I think we've seen a lot of improvement, and from my perspective, it's an area on which we could continue to work on within the, I would say, European asset management industry, also learning from good practices which have been implemented in the UK. And yeah, here I think it's about being clear on the policies, and also coming back to the topic of today's around disclosure, having the right disclosures in place on voting and engagement activity at fund level and at company level.
Thank you indeed, Clémence. A question for Christine, if I may. So the question is it not important to maintain that sustainability comes in many different shapes? Do you not fear that by introducing labels, financial market participants' ability to pursue different kinds of sustainable behavior will be reduced, thereby forcing specific sustainability behavior on financial market participants and on retail investors?
Just to be very clear, no one has taken a decision to introduce product categories. We are exploring the possibility. And it's indeed, I think, quite a formidable challenge to get this right, if one decides to do so. Because indeed, how do you design product categories? How do you define criteria or minimum thresholds, exclusions? You know, what do you base the categories on? The idea of hierarchy is definitely one that I've already mentioned. That's also something that I think is an important point. And how do you indeed, you know, prevent a kind of a choking off innovation, because that's not what we want to do. So there also needs to be a certain degree of flexibility. How do you compare? How do you make sure that everyone, every end investor, but also every financial advisor understands precisely, you know, what is the difference between the different product categories? How would you govern such a system? I mean, there are lots of questions around it, and that's why we're asking lots of questions on this in the consultation, because it's not an easy task. Obviously, we've seen that the FCA has recently come out with a policy statement. They are proposing or putting forward product categories. I think that's a very interesting approach, but I think it also shows that it's, you know, there are challenges involved, and I think we're all very clear that this would have to be really properly prepared and properly done to make sure that we don't end up with more confusion than clarity.
Many thanks, Christine. And there was another question which I will address as EIOPA, and the question was the MiFID Sustainability Preference Questionnaire, but I think we can also say the IDD Sustainability Preference Questionnaire, is a perfect example of quote-unquote bureaucratic overkill. Many investors choose not to state their preferences rather than answer the required question. Is EIOPA able to exert influence to quickly make the questions more practicable? On this one, I have to agree that the three categories of sustainability preferences are complicated to understand. We're talking about taxonomy-aligned investment, sustainable investments within the meaning of Article 9 SFDR, and principal adverse impact. And as Turan was mentioning, many people do not distinguish these terms. Even simpler ones, such as environmental from your social in ESG. Now, in the guidance that EIOPA issued in 2022, we highlighted the key role that advisors have in order to explain the preferences in the language that retail consumers understand. But we agree that more needs to be done here, also in terms of financial education. I will also mention that in the future, we can do some work as EIOPA to supervise the advice process and guide advisors to ensure that the questions given to consumers are more practicable and easier to understand. But it is a difficulty. Let's face it, it is a very complex framework. It has a very complex terminology, and if it's complex for very informed people, it is very complex for investors to understand as well. So I think more work needs to be done in this area. Let me just see if there was another question. No, I think that's it. We have 1 minute left, and I would like to give each of you 30 seconds for a closing statement. So can I start with you, Christine?
Sure, that's 2 minutes though. But anyway, I would just like to say, I think whenever we talk about making changes to the framework, which, as you rightly say, are probably needed, we should definitely always keep the end objective in mind. I think sometimes that gets a bit lost in all the technicalities, which is, how do we channel private investment into the transition? And I think that has to be always at the back of our minds, so that we keep focused on that goal.
Absolutely. Clémence?
Yes, just two things briefly. So first of all, as you said, Christine, I think let's keep in mind that we are at very early stage still for an action plan which intends to transform, the EU ecosystem. So if we look at the level of understanding already and I would say the intensity of change, let's look at how many people had views on the SFDR level 1 consultation. It's impressive. So it shows, how integrated it is. So for me, two key objectives now. Very short-term education, so the point which was just discussed, so continue education, continue capacity building to make sure that we address short-term challenges and we improve data and so on. And second priority, where need be, let's focus on continue to improve usability and adjust those regulations where needed, hopefully in I would say, not too long time.
Merci Clémence. Johannes?
I think the implementation of the SFDR has been a really good step forward in providing investors with structured sustainability information on financial products. Well, we believe that in the medium term, sustainable product labels for transition, sustainable and sustainable impact products could improve alignment with investor expectations and objectives. Minimum quality requirements, as well as additional disclosure requirements linked to these labels, could help guide financial market participants, distributors, and investors in making their sustainable investment decisions. So that's I think what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Johannes. And over to you, Torun, to conclude.
Oh, thank you. Yes, we have seen very positive changes in the last year, at least in terms of intention. But more intervention is necessary to make economic actors, including both investors and corporates, to change faster. There is also a need to improve, to enable the massive amount of savings in Europe to be channeled towards long-term green investments and give consumers the help they need to invest in certain activities that are to avoid investing in certain activities that are harmful for the climate and nature by flagging on products what they actually do invest in and what they don't invest in. Very important.
Many thanks, Torun. And this concludes our panel on the powers and pitfalls of sustainability transparency, with massive thanks to our panelists. I will hand over back to you, Pamela.
Thank you to all the panelists for this, for I think a panel which for me, as a result, concludes on the power of reporting, actually. And we've always said the sun is the best disinfectant, and the sun is burning these days. So I think we should continue the efforts on improving the SFDR. And I think you are great stakeholders and friends to do that. So I'm looking forward to continuing with all of you. Now it's time for the lunch break. And we've shortened a bit the lunch break because we extended a little bit the panel to adapt for everyone to join. So please try to come back at 1:15, because then I promise you will have a very interesting topical session on the transition risks to the financial sector, actually, in the coordinated one-off scenario analysis, which will be presented by my colleague, Matteo. So please come back at 1:15 and hope to see you soon then.